Hello and welcome back to another episode of Blurble Reasoning. Today we will be discussing the book The Alloy of Law, the first book in the second era of the Mistborn saga. Is it a saga? Do people refer to it as a saga? I don't know. Due to its nature as a continuation, it's basically book 4 in the series overall. I will not be refraining from discussing spoilers, so if you are here for a spoiler-free review, I'm afraid that is not what you're getting here today, and I would advise you turn around and vamoose before being spoiled on these excellent books. Now, the second era of Mistborn is something I've been curious about since I finished my first read-through of Era 1 all those years ago, back in the deep mists of time, also known as 2017, and the reason it took me this long is probably a combination of my distractibility and my kind of OCD-ness in terms of wanting to have the original era fresh in my mind, and then obviously after I'm done being distracted it's too late and I need to reread the first era, but we've been through this. But there's another reason as well why I was holding off on era 2, and that's because I knew that it advanced the timeline to more of an early industrial era slash Wild West slash Gold Rush era. I don't really know how you would describe it. I think this subgenre has a name, isn't it? Something like gunpowder fantasy or something like that. Flintlock fantasy, there we go. And while I've never been averse to stories set in this kind of time period, I'm also not someone who's ever really gone out of my way for those kinds of stories either. That being said, I am a huge fan of Avatar: The Legend of Korra, which similarly is kind of an era 2 to Avatar: The Last Airbender and sets technology forwards a decent ways, and you get a new cast of characters, kind of hints of the old cast of characters and their legacy, and you get to see how the world's evolved, and it's in a similar era. And yeah, basically I got Legend of Korra vibes from this, even though, you know, not aesthetically, it's different aesthetics. While The Legend of Korra also takes place during something of an industrial revolution, I would not say it is a Flintlock fantasy, but, you know, subgenres, they're very subjective, I think, when it comes to drawing lines. Also, it's now been a decent few years since I watched Legend of Korra as well. But yeah, obviously, just understanding the magic system of the first era, you can kind of cast your head forwards and imagine what Branderson might do with the magic systems in future eras, such as being able to, like, pull and push on bullets and stuff, and how that stuff affects things. And I think the evolution of a magic system alongside the technology of this world has been masterful. I especially liked the introduction of specialized bullets, which would trick certain mistings when used, such as like thinking they can push the bullet away, but it actually cracks away a certain layer of the bullet and then the bullet continues onwards. Or an entire gun itself, the Vindicator, which can only be cocked and ready to use by a coin shot, although now that I think about it, wouldn't it be a lurcher because he would pull the... I don't know enough about guns, ignore me. But yeah, we also see a really fun change up of the rules in this era, because suddenly Mistborn are a mythological thing of the past. They're not just rare, they just straight up don't exist, and in their place, the people wearing the mist cloaks now are twinborn mistings who have one allomantic power, and also ferrochemists who have one ferrochemical power. And I think that's just a really gosh dang fun way to mix up the magic system, keeping things familiar but playing with them in an interesting new way, and playing with different combinations and figuring out how that works, such as the villain of this piece being able to be kind of immortal, a little bit like the Lord Ruler was, except he will still age, but because he's double gold, he has the power to kind of burn gold within himself and also use that for ferrochemical use, and therefore like heighten its power, which I think is a really cool thing. Like, as a writer myself, I've often toyed in my mind about the idea of having two different kinds of powers which work multiplicatively with each other to make a character overpowered levels of strong. And it's really fun to have that come into play here. Also, I got to use the word multiplicatively in a sentence. Hell yeah, dude. Not only that, but we're just introduced to some new powers in general, new metals, or I guess a new metal at least, bend alloy, which allows which allows Wayne to create a speed bubble, and he does some really interesting things with that. Also, taking the concept of bubbles in general, it seems like there has kind of been the discovery of this new use of allomancy, such as Wax's ability to have this kind of semi-effective bullet repellent shield, which is going to be very useful in this New World, except suddenly we're now creating counters to that, so yeah. But yeah, speaking of the Twinborn stuff, I really liked for playing with the different combinations of powers, such as Wax being able to both be a coin shot and the ferrochemical ability to alter his weight, which allows him to kind of play with, you know, being able to zip around the room a lot better than a normal coin shot would be able to and stuff, and being able to increase his weight and therefore push on stuff a lot more powerfully than he should otherwise be able to. On the surface of it, it might not be the most crazy combination of powers one might imagine, but it does end up working out in some really fun and interesting ways, especially the scene in the end when he launches himself into a sky, makes himself extremely heavy, and then pushes down and basically just implodes the building below him. That was so fucking cool. And then you've got Wayne, who doesn't like using guns because of his past and instead uses a pair of dueling canes. He is what is known as a slider, which is someone who is able to make a speed bubble, which doesn't allow him to just run around a place like the Flash, but it does allow him to stop mid-battle to assess the situation or dodge between bullets incredibly quickly and stuff like that. But then he also has that gold healing factor, not to the length that Miles, the antagonist, has it, but he has the healing factor so that when he does inevitably get injured in his close quarters combat scrapes in this world of guns, he is able to heal himself, and we see him make full usage of those powers when the assassination attempt happens within Wax's mansion or manor or whatever we're calling it by his butler. I also really enjoyed... Okay, I listened to the Audible version of this. I don't know if she's Meracy or Neracy, but I really liked that she had this seemingly useless power of basically having the opposite of Wayne's power, which is she's able to slow down time or speed up time. I forget. It's a bit weird, the language with it, because of the different perspectives in play, but basically she has the ability to make the world outside her bubble pass really, really quickly. And how could that be useful? Turns out it's really useful when you send someone for backup. And they might take 12 hours to get there, but it's more like, 30 seconds or whatever it was to her, and that actually ended up being really useful. Speaking of the characters themselves, and we'll get more into the world portion as well in a minute, I really enjoyed every character in this book. Wax is such a fun protagonist. He's like this almost Batman style, like, he's not a vigilante, although he kind of is in this book a little bit. But, this man with a lot of money and a history and great fighting ability and renown, and, he's trying to get on with his life. He's got a troubled past, as we see in chapter 1 or the prologue or whatever it was. He's more of a sheriff type figure, which is interesting considering in the previous era we were spending time with the criminals, I guess, the underside of a city. And it seems like what Brandon Sanderson is trying to say is, in that world, the robbers were in the right. In this world, the robbers are in the wrong. There may be more to it than that. I mean, we do see that Wax realizes that Miles had a point, but Miles was trying to invoke something called the Survivor's Mandate, and that's another really interesting element of the world building in this era as well, is just seeing how the religions and the mythology of the first era has evolved into this 300 years later. But one would imagine that the Survivor's Mandate is basically just something that says, if you are being oppressed by an antagonistic ruling force, overthrow them and, undermine them. We're still yet to see the full extent of Miles and Wax's uncle's plans, but I'm sure we'll get into that as the series goes on. But not to gloss over Wayne, because Wayne is fantastic. If you didn't read this as an audiobook, by the way, narrated by Michael Kramer, I highly recommend it because of Wayne alone. Wayne obviously being someone who plays with disguises and accents and thinks a lot about people's different accents and how they change and evolve over time, and how people's expectations are formed by how people sound. I honestly would not be surprised to learn that Brandon Sanderson's inspiration for Wayne came from listening to the Wheel of Time audiobooks, which I know he did when he was younger. But also the dynamic Wax and Wayne have is just so fun. Just every gunfight, there's a scene where Wayne basically pauses time and they stop and they have a little tiff in the middle of it. They're a really fun pair, and their different combat abilities and stuff go together really well as well. They complement each other perfectly. I will say, I think where this book fell down a little bit for me was just the general plot, and I think that's no fault of the books itself. It's basically just an introductory novel, especially since it's a lot shorter than any of the original Mistborn books were. The plot doesn't feel that intriguing, I guess, compared to maybe The Final Empire or Hero of Ages. As much as I was loving exploring the world and spending time with the characters, I wasn't that infused about learning what was going to happen next, and honestly I think that alone just barely holds this book back from being a 5 out of 5. But I think that's definitely ramping up. My intrigue is ramping up, especially based on the epilogue of this book, where we see old Iron Eyes himself. Marsh is still alive and active within this world, which I did not expect, or at least he seems to be. I'm taking it with a pinch of salt because he is a mythological figure that is widely known among the populace. This is a world in which at one point a race of beings existed who were able to change their forms. I'm pretty sure they're not coming back, but you never know. Maybe Caesar decided to bring them back. Or this could even be Kelsier himself acting from beyond the grave. I don't know why he would want to impersonate his brother or how he would, but one tiny bit of dialogue gives it away for me, where he talks about how Breeze was always better at manipulating emotions than he was, which is something that was mentioned in the original trilogy, talking about like, oh, you know, Kelsier can teach me emotional allomancy, but he's nowhere near as good at it as Breeze is. And honestly, it might just be happenstance, but I don't think we ever saw Marsh, even though he would have been able to as an Inquisitor, I don't think we ever saw Marsh use emotional allomancy. At least I think he would have been able to as an Inquisitor. My lore is a little rusty because I read a book in between, but still. It probably is Marsh, but I'm just like, maybe it's not though. I mean, I guess if someone was going to impersonate him, they wouldn't go so far as to include his wound he took at the end of the third book around his eye, when I assume that's when Vin was trying to kill him, but I can't, oh my god. I literally read this book like a month ago and I'm already forgetting elements of it. It's time for another reread. But yeah, if you were just going to impersonate him, you probably wouldn't need to go into that detail, because I don't know if that detail would have survived into mythological tellings. Still, I didn't sit bolt upright. I was walking home from work when I was listening to it. But I was so surprised by Marsh showing up. And that's a perfect segue into talking about the world and the timeline change and the evolution of things. It seems that we have different religions, such as the Parthians, who follow Caesar as the god Harmony, and his teachings such as don't worship me lol, and take a look through these other religions that I had in my metal minds and take some learnings from them. We have the Survivorism, we have a Church of the Survivor still, although that seems to have subtly changed a little bit over the years, as one would expect it to, in terms of, you know, the Survivor's mandate wasn't something we ever saw mentioned in the first era. But it's interesting to consider, you know, you've got this inversion of right and wrong, law and disorder and stuff, and does the Church of the Survivor become something darker in this era because it's quote-unquote not needed? We did explore in Book 3, Hero of Ages of the first era, with Spook, you know, just how, and like what he saw in, oh god, Tresting? It wasn't Tresting. Nouns. We saw how belief in the survivors' beliefs can go too far. And this time around, it's interesting to explore, well, is it going too far this time, or is it not? Judging on Miles's means, I'm gonna say probably too far, or at least his way of doing things ain't right, like kidnapping women to breed more allomancers is kind of fucking gross. Although technically we still don't know if that is what they're doing. But if it is, that's pretty irredeemable. Unredeemable? Irredeemable. Yeah. Yeah. In looking that up to see if it was a word, I discovered a new graphic novel that I think I'm interested in. Anyway, Miles follows something called Trellism, which I know was mentioned in the first era, and I'm racking my brain trying to remember what it was about. It was definitely one of Caesar's religions that he was studying. It might have been the one that Kelsier ended up kind of following to make himself a martyr, but I'm not sure. I'm scared to look it up in case I get spoilers. But I remember it stood out to me because a character in another book series I'm reading has the surname Trell. I remember being like, oh, Trell, interesting. If you can tell me what book series that is, I'll give you a cookie. I think that was a fourth religion as well, but I can't quite remember what it was. Oh, I might be wrong on that, actually. I remember now, it was someone talking about Iron Eyes and the legend of Iron Eyes and how he's the god of death, but I don't know if that necessarily means it's its own religion or if he's just part of another religion as a mythological figure within it. Either way, it's also really interesting to see this take place in a city called Ellendel, obviously named after Elend, and the passing remarks to like the founders and the field of rebirth and Lord Mistborn and the words of founding and all these things. Something this book does really well as a Flintlock fantasy, probably because it's a subgenre I'm not really familiar with, is it explores that kind of time period in a way which makes things that I've always had in my brain and taken for granted, but as the modern world of the time, and that recontextualizes a lot of things. Suddenly, for the first time, I'm thinking about how interesting it is, this evolution of civilization, where for the first time, there's this grand sprawling city which is home to millions, and there's crime waves, and people don't really understand how to deal with the crime because they apprehend the criminals and then more of them pop up. And there's just now research being done into the idea of urban renewal and urban planning and growth, and the fact that if you put time and effort into making an area nicer, people are going to be less inclined to see themselves in a way which might inspire criminality, which is, I'm not a criminologist, I'm sure just one of the many reasons why this kind of stuff occurs. But it's just like electricity and the fact that light bulbs are a new thing, and just the way people feel about electricity, like being suspicious of wires and stuff. Like, obviously I knew in my brain, if I thought about that time period in our world, I'd be like, yeah, of course there was a time when electricity was new and light bulbs were a thing, and for the first time, and people were like, oh wow, look at this marvelous thing. But I never really dug deep into it in a way which made me consider the ramifications of these major changes in the world and what it means for the human race. And it's really interesting that this book, which is set in a fantasy world, a made-up world, is able to do that to me for the real world. It's like how I've had times in adulthood where I've gone from, yeah, space is a thing that's interesting, to actually researching and watching videos about astronomy and stuff and having a newfound appreciation for the insanity that is our reality in the grand scale of things. Don't get me started. And also how I sometimes hyperfixate on certain eras of the past, like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and the Vikings and stuff, and think about how the world was so different back then. And it's that same kind of thing, like things you were taught as a kid growing up that you didn't give a second thought with an adult brain. And now for the first time I'm looking back on this era of history and going, yeah, that is interesting. Might be down for more of this kind of thing. The last thing I really have to say about this book is the romance subplot, which I found interesting and refreshingly realistic, because it feels like romance subplots always lead to the same conclusion of a romance blossoming and that kind of thing. And in this book, it led to the opposite, or not necessarily the opposite, but it led to our protagonist, Wax, going, no, it would be a bad idea if I followed Nereus's interests in me down this path. I'm too old for her, etc., etc. And I won't lie, there have been eyebrow-raising moments for me with just the amount of romances in Brandon Sanderson books which have a significant age gap. I guess it's just a trope of romance set in a time period before our own. I personally don't even know what my opinions are on age gap romances in real life. Of course, if you're two consenting adults, do what you like. But I think another thing that was inherently problematic was that Nereus's, I really don't know, I should look this up. Her interest in Wax was originally formed on the myth and the legend of this sheriff from the Roughs. Sheriff is never a word that's used in this book, but he's basically a sheriff. This lawkeeper. They say lawkeeper, right? And while she came to know him more personally and stuff, I don't know, it just doesn't feel right. I don't know if they're going to pursue that in future books, and I'm going to end up looking like an idiot for saying that it's a good thing that this romance didn't occur. But it was refreshing to see him turn her down at the end of this book instead of the usual. And then they ignored all their trepidations and got together in the end, and so on and so forth. But I feel like it would just be more interesting to have a strong friendship grow between these two characters after this failed romance plot, and see how Nereus's character might grow moving forwards on her own. I don't know, call me crazy, maybe I'm barking up the wrong tree here, but I think it could be cool. Was not rooting for them, to be honest. Anyway, I think that's about all my thoughts on this book. This is the most awesome 4 out of 5 I think I've ever given. And I can only see it getting better from here. Apparently it does get better from here. I've heard people say that the first book in this, it's not a trilogy, I keep going to call it trilogy, it's not a trilogy. The first book in this era is apparently not as good as later books. So yeah, I'm interested to see how things build. If the revelation about Iron Eyes at the end there is anything to go by, I think starting to mix Era 1 characters in with the Era 2 timeline could be really cool and fun. Oh, also I forgot to mention about Caesar talking to Wax at the end there when he really needed him, which I thought was a really cool touch as well. Anyway, that really is going to do it for me now. I'm done rambling, and I will catch you in whatever I make next.